On behalf of the League of Women Voters, I'm happy to welcome all of you to this afternoon's debate. I'm going to begin by outlining the format for the debate. This is a League of Women Voters format that the candidates have been familiarized with prior to the debate. There are no opening statements in this debate. Each candidate has 2 minutes to respond to the same question. All questions have been solicited from the audience or solicited in advance by the League from members of the press. I will read the question to the candidates. One candidate will have an opportunity to respond. I will then repeat the question unless the candidate signals to me that it is unnecessary for me to repeat the question, and that candidate will have a chance to respond. At the close of those initial responses, each candidate has a bank of 5 minutes total for the debate to provide rebuttal to any one of the questions. Candidates are not required to use the full 2 minutes for response to the individual questions, and what they leave from an unanswered question will be then put in the bank time for the questions. And if that wasn't confusing enough for all of you, we'll try and make it a little bit more so as we go along. That was a joke, but you don't have to worry about it. I'm going to introduce the candidates, and then I'm going to admonish the audience as Helen did, and then I'm going to begin with the first question. So the first question is going to go to State Senator Sam Caligieri, whose bio says he is a lifelong resident of the 5th District who has a deep demonstrated commitment to serving his community. He is currently finishing his 2nd term as a state senator representing Cheshire, Wolcott, Southernton, and Waterbury. Prior to serving in the state Senate, Sam served as acting mayor of Waterbury during one of the darkest chapters of that city's history. He led unprecedented ethics and financial reforms. About his service as acting mayor, the Hartford Courant wrote that Sam served with distinction. Sam has been active in various community and civic organizations. He served as chairman of the board of directors of the United Way of Greater Waterbury and as a trustee of the Connecticut Community Foundation. Sam has served as a member of the board of directors of the Governor's Prevention Partnership, Connecticut Legal Services, and the Greater Waterbury Chamber of Commerce. He also served on Governor Jody Amrell's Commission on Education Finance. Sam resides in Waterbury with his wife Lori and their 2 children, Grace and Owen. Congressman Chris Murphy is currently serving his 2nd term representing Connecticut's 5th District, which includes the cities of Waterbury, Danbury, Meriden, and New Britain. He serves on the Energy and Commerce Committee and the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. He has been a leader here in New Britain, fighting for jobs with his Buy American legislative efforts, supporting New Britain's schools this summer when budget constraints could have led to layoffs and oversized classrooms, and helping the city's community health center expand to serve people in need of health care. Prior to his service in the U.S. House of Representatives, Congressman Murphy served for 8 years in the Connecticut General Assembly. While in the Senate, he served as the chairman of the Public Health Committee. Congressman Murphy grew up in Connecticut and attended Williams College in Massachusetts and UConn Law School. Congressman Murphy and his wife, Kathy Hollahan, a legal aid attorney who represents children in need in New Britain and Waterbury, live in Cheshire with their son, Owen. Please take a moment to welcome the candidates to the debate. Ladies and gentlemen, during the course of the debate, that was your one and only opportunity to voice your pleasure or displeasure with anything the candidates are saying. I urge you to keep your opinions in check and allow the candidates to share their positions with us fairly and freely. If anyone does disrupt these proceedings, I will stop the proceedings immediately and ask you to please contain yourself. Everyone is here to hear the candidates provide open, free responses to these questions that are of concern to all of us, and so I admonish you, please keep your opinions to yourself and your applause to yourself until the conclusion of the debate. So, by coin toss, State Senator Caligieri is going to is going to have the first closing statement, or has elected to have the first closing statement, and Congressman Murphy is going to answer the question first. So, the first question, Congressman Murphy. No? First question goes to you. Tell us, as a congressman, what your #1 issue will be to address immediately.
Number 1, 2, and 3 for this economy are jobs. And for New Britain, that matters more than anything. I'm glad to be here to join you all for what I think is going to be a very informative debate for the next hour. Thank you in particular to the League, to the Herald, and to this wonderful facility here at Trinity on Main. It is a pleasure to be here, and I'm so appreciative of all of your work to open this up to the community. I think the question moving forward in this debate is whether we want to create jobs by moving forward or going backward. I believe that we create jobs first and foremost by targeting tax relief to the middle class and the small businesses. That's why I'm proud to have supported $800 billion of tax cuts for the middle class and almost $90 billion of tax cuts for small businesses. We need to recognize the strength of our economy, which in the New Britain area and the Waterbury area lies in manufacturing. That's why I've led an effort in Washington to build American manufacturing by targeting federal purchasing to domestic manufacturers. And then we've got to have a sense of what our future economy is. I believe that lies in green technology and clean energy. That's why I'm a supporter of energy reform. Senator Caligiuri and I differ on almost all of these issues. Senator Caligiuri would target a large degree of tax cuts to a percentage of the population that won't return it into the economy. Senator Caligiuri seeks to stand up for outsourcers and opposes many of the provisions of my Buy America legislation. And there's also a difference between us on the issue of renewable energy. Senator Caligiuri consistently has supported returning this country to the policies of the Bush administration, which got us into this mess in the first place. I think we need to change the way that we do business in this country so that we can create real jobs. That's investing in middle class tax relief, small business tax relief, and seeing the future of this economy, which lies in clean and green energy jobs. It is a miserable time out there for people trying to make it in this economy. And the question is whether we want to move forward or whether we want to move backwards.
Senator Caligiuri, the same question for you, please. Tell us, as a congressman, what will be your #1 issue that you will address immediately?
Well, let me begin by thanking you, Professor, for being a part of this, thanking the League, the sponsors, and thanking each and every one of you here for being a part of this very important debate during what will be one of the most important elections we faced in this country in a very, very long time. And it is a pleasure and a privilege for me to share the stage once again with Congressman Murphy. We've had 2 very spirited debates thus far. I'm sure today is not going to be an exception, but I think it's a very excellent exchange of ideas. The absolute reason I'm running is to get the economy turned around again and creating jobs. And that's an area where, as are often the case, Congressman Murphy and I agree on the problem. But we have vast differences over how best to solve those problems. Congressman Murphy has supported an approach which is taking more money out of your pockets, bringing it to Washington, D.C. in the form of a stimulus bill that failed. It was supposed to create 3.5 million jobs. The New York Times reports that we've lost more jobs than we've actually created. At the same time, taxes are going up. We've never seen spending at as high a rate as we're seeing today. And ultimately, people are getting crushed as a result. There's 13% unemployment in New Britain. Several other major cities have unemployment in the double-digit figures. We have over 9% unemployment in Connecticut. The approach that Congressman Murphy and Nancy Pelosi have advocated have failed. I would do it very differently. The way we create jobs is by putting as much money back in the hands of your families and in the businesses in this community as we can. We do that by starting to get spending under control. Right now, we're spending at an absolutely alarming rate. We need to reduce the federal deficit, which I would do by putting tough spending caps in place, and we need to make sure that we return capital into the marketplace as much as we can by keeping taxes low, which is why I would support a full extension of the tax cuts from 01 and 03 at all levels, because raising the highest rate is an enormous tax increase on small business.
Let's stay with the jobs. What are you doing to keep #1 jobs in Connecticut 2, prevent privatization. 3, promote green jobs in Connecticut.
Well, the most important thing we can do to keep jobs in Connecticut is to keep Connecticut and its economy competitive. And that ultimately means making sure that we keep the cost of doing business in Connecticut as low as possible. The reason why we ultimately have an outsourcing of jobs outside of Connecticut to Georgia and to other countries is that when companies are doing the math and they're doing the analysis, they're realizing that it costs a lot more to do business in Connecticut than it does in the rest of the world and in other jurisdictions around the country. And so we need to keep the cost in the United States and in Connecticut as low as possible. I believe that the policies being advocated by Congressman Murphy have made it harder for Connecticut companies to be more competitive. So what we need to do is make sure that we cut the corporate tax rate from 35% to 25% in line with countries around the world. We need to make sure that we provide tax relief to small businesses by extending the 01 and 03 tax cuts at all levels, because 75% of the small businesses today aren't paying the corporation tax, they're actually paying the individual tax rate. So when you're raising that highest rate, you're raising taxes on a lot of small businesses. That would be devastating. So those are the things we need to do to keep jobs in Connecticut and to keep jobs in the United States. Privatization or outsourcing. Was it privatization or outsourcing, Professor? What was the second part?
The second question was prevent privatization, and 3, promote green jobs in Connecticut.
Well, I don't think privatization is a bad idea. I think privatization is actually a more efficient way for government to deliver its services. And the way to have green jobs is to make sure that we're making a long-term investment in those technologies through tax policy to make sure that we're creating economic incentive for research and development in the area of green jobs and green technology, and that we have a tax structure that's making it as affordable for those companies to develop that technology into sustainable jobs for the future. Fuel cells is one of many examples of that.
I'll repeat the question. What are you doing to keep, number 1, jobs in Connecticut, number 2, prevent privatization, number 3, promote green jobs in Connecticut?
Well, the idea that Senator Gallegary proffers, that we need to extend the full range of Bush tax cuts because that's what's going to propel our economy forward, is laughable when you walk the streets of New Britain. How did the Bush tax cuts do for us here? When the average millionaire, just on the last round of tax cuts, got about $40,000 additional dollars, and the average New Britain worker got $19. What has it meant for our economy? We're living right now with the consequences of the Bush economic policy. And so I fundamentally disagree with the notion that the answer to what ails our economy today is to simply extend the policies of the Bush administration. That's a recipe for disaster. We need to turn the corner. We need to turn the corner so that we are investing in middle-class tax relief and in small business tax relief. We have to turn the corner so we're getting serious about paying down our deficits. Senator Gallegary says that he would impose spending caps, but hasn't proposed any specific major spending cuts that he would endorse. And the reason that I support Buy American legislation, and that Senator Gallegary is less than enthusiastic about it, I think speaks to a continued strength of our economy here in New Britain, which is manufacturing. I do not understand why Senator Gallegary either continues to change his position or stands in opposition to portions of my work to try to make sure that when we send taxpayer dollars to Washington, that all of those dollars come back to create jobs here in the United States. That should be something that we all agree on. Frankly, I've introduced it with Republicans in the House of Representatives because it is a source of bipartisan support. But Senator Gallegary's unwillingness to stand up to the outsourcers, unwillingness to stand up for American jobs, is incredibly troubling to the kind of economy that we need to grow here. And with respect to green energy, this is a tremendous opportunity for our economy. We have lost our leadership role in the world with respect to the new green energy economy. Senator Gallegary on his website spends about a half a paragraph talking about what he'd do to try to create green energy jobs. This needs to be an imperative for this nation. It can't be done just by middling around the edges of tax incentive policy, as Senator Gallegary wants. We need transformational energy policy so as to create a domestic market, to create a domestic economy for renewable energy.
That's time.
I'd like to opportunity, please. Congressman, if you were so committed to preventing outsourcing, you should not have supported a stimulus bill that sent $3.5 billion in tax credits to Chinese companies. We should have kept that here. Number 2, I support Buy American. It's been something that both parties have supported for a very long time, since the 1930s. but I oppose your proposal because I think it's going to do a lot more harm than good, which is one of the reasons why the National Association of Manufacturers opposes it. Number three, I disagree strongly with what the Bush administration did in the spending area. Republicans and the Bush administration were guilty of spending every bit as much as we used to accuse the Democrats of doing. And one of the things and one of the strengths that I bring to this race is that I've actually stood up in Connecticut as the lone person to vote against the state budget, be called the last sane man in Hartford, even though it meant disagreeing with my own party, because it was wrong. We were spending too much. That's the kind of leadership I'm going to bring to Washington, and which Congressman Murphy has failed to deliver on, notwithstanding his promises over the last 4 years. And finally, all you have to do is ask a small business person like Mark Bernanke, and I'm just picking on him because he's right there. When you raise taxes on small businesses, you're crushing them. The National Federation of Independent Businesses says that 75% of small businesses aren't paying the corporation tax. They're paying the individual tax rate that Chris Murphy wants to increase. The rate at which Chris Murphy wants to increase that taxes affects businesses that represent over 54% of the revenue generated by small businesses throughout this country and represent over 25% of the American workforce. What Congressman Murphy says sounds good, but it's a disaster as economic policy.
I'll use the rebuttal time. Senator Calogero, your numbers don't make sense here. Right now, amongst those income taxpayers who make over $250,000, you're talking about 2% of small businesses. Now, I would absolutely support making sure that we do not raise taxes on those individuals who pay their business income through their individual income taxes. But once again, what I think we're failing to hear is the spending cuts, the major meaningful spending cuts that you would endorse in order to pay for the $700 billion that would be necessary, otherwise blowing a hole in the budget in order to pay for those tax cuts on the upper 2% of income earners. With respect to Buy America, I listen to Connecticut manufacturers. You take your direction from the National Association of Manufacturers. I take my direction from Connecticut manufacturers. The Connecticut Association of Manufacturers, in fact, is a strong supporter of targeting federal dollars to federal contracts here in Connecticut. The portion of my legislation that you oppose is pretty simple. Right now, we have a provision that says we should spend 50% of the money that we send to Washington on domestic manufacturing. That's too low. It's too low in part because we built in loophole after loophole to that law that means that sometimes only 20% of our dollars, our taxpayer dollars, are being used on U.S. manufacturing. The portion of my legislation that you oppose would close some of those most egregious loopholes and simply increase the percentage to 60%. The difference between us is the difference between millions of manufacturing jobs being outsourced out of this country. And I still do not understand why you're unwilling to stand up for domestic manufacturing jobs.
I just need from the timekeepers, Senator Calagieri's remaining bank time. 4 minutes left, so if you would like to continue the rebuttal, you have 4 minutes.
Well, just on the point of spending, Congressman, you've said that you won't support another federal budget unless it reduces spending by 1%. What specific cuts will get you to that 1%, sir?
Defense cuts. Defense cuts to unnecessary programs like the alternate engine. The alternate engine program, Senator Calagieri, is costing us $500 million a year, and the Defense Department doesn't even want it. Cuts in agricultural subsidies to Midwestern farmers that are getting paid to produce nothing, are getting paid money that they don't need. Cuts in unnecessary incentives for products like ethanol. That's just 3 to start. So I am perfectly willing to propose billions of dollars in specific spending cuts, and as you have noted, I am willing to use my vote in order to do that.
Gentlemen, let me clarify.
I appreciate the question.
If you ask a question of the other candidate, it comes out of your bank time.
That's fine.
Okay.
But look, you've just heard nothing in the way of specific cuts. And the reason for it is the way to make responsible cuts. The way you make responsible cuts is you take a hard look at the budget once we've set the levels of spending that we need to be agreed on. What I've said I would do is support a cap of spending at the federal level amounting to getting us back to 20% of the gross domestic product, which was where we were for over 10 years before Congressman Murphy and Nancy Pelosi took us up to 25% of gross domestic product. That represents $666 billion in cuts. And there are a lot of ways we need to do it, but neither of us, ladies and gentlemen, can possibly tell you line item everything we would do today. And Congressman couldn't do it, and I can't do it. But the point is, I'm a proven cutter. Congressman Murphy is a proven spender.
I'll take 30 seconds more of my rebuttal time.
I guess it's coming out of my time.
Yeah, this will come out of my time. If I wrote them down, Senator Calagieri, maybe it'd be easier for you to understand. I gave you 3 specific ideas. You had
no dollars.
You had yet another opportunity provide one single major spending cut that you would propose, and you didn't do it. $6 billion is the agricultural subsidies. $3 billion is that just one simple wasteful program in the defense line item. I'm giving them to you. I'm not sure why you're not hearing them.
Gentlemen, let's move on to another question. This one for Representative Murphy first. Connecticut highways are not keeping up with our needs for transportation. What federal transportation programs do you support to provide transit throughout the state for both long distance and local needs?
Well, listen, the salvation of our economy in a lot of ways here in Connecticut comes from our investment in transportation. We are poised for such amazing economic growth here, not only because of the quality of our workforce, but because of our proximity to two of the major economic hubs of the Northeast, Boston and New York. We are fortunate in that we get, as a state, $1.6 back for every dollar we send to the federal government with respect to transportation. Part of the problem lies in that the state government continues to dramatically underfund transportation. It is one of the lowest contributing states in the nation. We need, both from a state perspective and a federal perspective, to figure out a way to get this right. And it's not just highways. We do have crumbling highways in Connecticut that we need to rebuild. But we need to invest in intermodal transportation. We need to figure out the power of rail. I've been proud to support. In the stimulus bill that Senator Caligiuri suggests has created no jobs, hundreds of jobs right here in Connecticut, building a new high-speed rail line from Springfield to New Haven. That's not only going to create jobs as it's built, but create jobs as we can more easily move people and goods through this important economic corridor. We need to improve the existing branch lines coming out of the 5th District, from Waterbury down to Bridgeport and Danbury down to Norwalk. That comes with a federal investment. And it comes in part with a greater state investment, but it is certainly part of the future economic engine of this state.
Senator Caligiuri, Connecticut highways are not keeping up with our needs for transportation. What federal transportation programs do you support to provide transit throughout the state for both long distance and local needs?
This is an area where Congressman Murphy and I largely agree. I think the short answer and the most effective answer, we need to pass a transportation bill in Washington. One has been languishing for years. We're hurting as a result of that. Infrastructure is one of the core functions of the federal government. That includes rail, roads, bridges, absolutely critical to our infrastructure and to our economy. We need more leadership out of Washington. That comes by passing a transportation bill. And so that's something I look forward to supporting. You know, the stimulus bill that Congressman Murphy references was supposed to create 3.5 million jobs. It's been reported that we've actually lost more jobs than we've created. And yet at the same time, we've gone from having a budget deficit of about $100 billion when Congressman Murphy took office to having a budget deficit now of $1.2 trillion. We've got federal spending that's at record levels of 25% of the gross domestic product. It's absolutely crushing us. It is not sustainable. The better way to have done the stimulus bill would be to have made it 2/3 tax cuts, 1/3 spending, not the way Congressman Murphy did it, which was 1/3 tax cuts, 2/3 spending. You know, this was supposed to be helping the trades. We have 30% unemployment rate among the trades. We have $20 billion that was allocated 19 months ago in the stimulus bill for infrastructure that's still sitting in Washington. So it was fundamentally the wrong way to try to create economic growth. And everybody is hurting as a result. But I think where we both agree is that we need to have a strong transportation bill, and it's something that I will be supporting as a congressman.
Quick rebuttal. The analysis is that the Recovery Act saved or created 2 million jobs in this country. And if you do spend some time walking the streets of New Britain, you'll see how that's made a difference to people. We created 100 jobs right up the street with the construction of a new building for our community health center. Right across the street, the Boys and Girls Club is expanding their potential, creating jobs and creating a future for children. And frankly, in fact, a large portion of the Recovery Act was just designed to keep people whole during this recession. Now, I'll admit that some of that doesn't create jobs, but it makes sure that there's food on the table. Make sure that there's a roof over people's head. You visit a food bank here in New Britain, and 1/3 to 1/2 of the food that they're serving is paid for in part through the Recovery Act. So I will admit that some of the money in that bill isn't designed to create jobs. Some of that money is designed to keep people alive. And as a compassionate nation, I think that's one of our most important endeavors.
Next question goes first to Representative Murphy. How will you balance the continuing costs of military actions with the costs of domestic needs?
Well, thank you for the question. I opposed the war in Iraq, ran as a candidate opposing the war in Iraq because not only did I believe that it was putting this country at risk by engaging in a war of choice, but because I didn't think that this country could afford it. And I voted against several of the supplemental funding bills in my first 2 years, and voted against the last supplemental funding bill for both the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, because I don't think that we can continue to afford paying for these wars with deficit financing. You want to look at all of the reasons in which we have a record level of debt, and this president inherited a record level of debt. It's in part because we fought wars that we did not pay for. Now, does that mean that we don't stand up for ourselves as a nation and fight battles that are necessary? Absolutely. But we don't enter into wars of choice that we don't need to. And we don't do it without paying for it. The fact is that we have thousands of brave men and women in this state who are fighting and dying for this country every day. Unfortunately, only 1% of Americans have made that choice, and the other 99% aren't being asked enough to participate in this fight. I opposed the Iraq war on those grounds. I opposed the latest supplemental funding bill for the Iraq and Afghanistan wars because we can't afford to continue to deficit finance our foreign obligations.
How will you balance the continuing costs of military actions with the costs of domestic needs?
Thank you. You don't have to deficit finance our military. If you put tough enforceable spending caps in place, as I propose, on the entire federal budget, which then forces Congress and members of both parties to have to make some very tough decisions about what our funding priorities should be. From my perspective, you've got to go back to what the core function of the federal government is in the first place. If nothing else, the federal government is there to protect our national defense. Necessarily, that means spending whatever we need to spend to win the wars we are engaged in, to have the finest, strongest military humanly possible, and we should never seek to balance the budget on the backs of our military or on the backs of our national defense. And that is how I would prioritize, because it is the central core mission of the federal government. Now, the way you can do that then is that when you combine that priority with spending caps on the whole budget, then you have to start making some tough decisions about how you're going to spend other money. And those are tough decisions that neither party has been willing to make, but which I've been willing and able to make over the years that I've been involved in government. That's how we need to get spending under control, but we can't do it on the backs of the military and our national defense. It's wrong.
The Iraq war alone has cost this country almost $1 trillion. Senator Gallagher, are you suggesting that you would have supported the Iraq war and cut domestic spending by $1 trillion in order to finance it?
I supported it. I would have voted for the Iraq war based on the intelligence that we had at the time. And I would have done everything humanly possible to make sure we funded it and that we did it in the way that made sure we didn't have to raise taxes or spend money out of the road. Yes. We can't have it all, ladies and gentlemen. We can't have it all. We've got to make tough decisions. Neither party, certainly not Congressman Murphy, has been willing to make those tough decisions, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why we see record deficits. That's why we see a crumbling economy, 13% in New Britain alone. That's where we're seeing big government, higher taxes, greater regulation, government being the answer to every problem, failing us.
Senator Gallagher, you can't paper over that last answer with anger. You just said that you would have supported the Iraq war and supported cutting domestic spending by $1 trillion in order to finance it. I'm going to tell you, you're not going to find many people in this district who would agree with that position. And I think it speaks to the decisions that you will make when faced with a circumstance like that in the future.
What I've said is that once we made that decision, we had to fund it properly, and we had to do it in a fiscally responsible manner. But I've got to tell you, the notion that you would try to grow the economy by passing something in the form of the stimulus bill, which added $814 billion to the deficit, seeing our deficit increase from $1 billion when you took office to $1.2 trillion when you took office, certainly wasn't fiscal responsibility.
Please hold your applause. Thank you. Gentlemen, the next question, Senator Caligiuri first. This is about the Child Nutrition Act. The recession is meeting families with young children hard. Will you support reauthorizing the Child Nutrition Act with funding to improve school lunches without taking money out of food stamps?
I've seen firsthand in my own home community of Waterbury how devastating the economic downturn can be. And having served on our United Way board for many years, including as chairman, I was very involved in the process by which we distributed as much money as we could to organizations in need and to people in need. And our top priority was always taking care of children and families. I will support reauthorization of the Act. At exactly what levels remains to be seen based on where we are with the federal deficit and the budget at the time that I have the opportunity to vote on. But it would be my intention to vote to reauthorize it. It's critical, especially in a down economy. But at what levels of spending, I cannot tell you today.
Representative Murphy, the recession is meeting families with young children hard. Will you support reauthorizing the Child Nutrition Act with funding to improve school lunches without taking money out of food stamps?
I will. I will. There's nothing more important than making sure the kids show up to school ready to learn. And it's an important program to fund, and it shouldn't be funded by Rob and Peter to pay Paul. This is about choices, Senator Caligiuri. And what you just told us is that you would have supported the Iraq War and cut domestic spending by $1 trillion in order to fund it. Let me tell you what one of the programs would have been that would have been gutted, the school nutrition program. Now, if you'd like to offer others that would have accounted for that $1 trillion worth of funding, I'm happy to hear them. But there are tough choices that have to be made. And when you engage in talk about spending cuts, having been asked over and over again what major spending cuts you actually propose and are unwilling to answer, I think we're just left to guess where that would be. I hope you do support school nutrition, and we'll hold you to that. But here in New Britain, we're hurting. And the reason that I supported an emergency authorization bill for education funding this summer, $10 billion that was paid for, was because in this city we were about to move 40 kids to an elementary school classroom. We were about to lose a whole year's worth of education for New Britain kids. I listened to teachers, I listened to students, I listened to parents grieving over what was about to happen in their school system, and I supported an emergency authorization of federal funding. You opposed that. That's what happens, I think, when you listen to the priorities here in New Britain. That's what happens when you bring the choices that those families want you to make to your work in Congress.
I just said I would support it, but at what spending levels remains to be seen, Congressman.
Listen, the devil's in the details, Senator Caligiuri. Supporting the bill at 50% of funding in order to finance a tax cut for billionaires as a consequence. And that's what we're talking about here, is not whether you'd support the program, but whether the question was whether you would support it without cutting money for food stamps. And it's wonderful to be able to say that you support giving $100,000 in tax cuts to a millionaire without actually identifying where you would cut funding. That's one of the places that you would probably support cutting funding. That's all I'm saying here, Senator Caligiuri, is that I think there's a growing frustration with your inability to identify what spending cuts you would identify, and I would suggest that when you look at the amount of cuts that you would have to impose on a discretionary budget, you'll probably be looking at nutrition programs for children here in New Britain.
Well, just for the sake of discussion, so I can be as clear as I can be, the extension of the 01 and 03 tax cut at the highest levels would cost about $36 billion. You can pay for that, for starters, by freezing domestic spending at current levels, which would save about $53 billion. And among the various spending cuts that I would support include making sure the stimulus doesn't become a permanent part of the federal budget. Number two, government auditors have identified 20% of the government programs that failed to reach their stated objectives. Eliminating those programs eliminating those programs would save us $123 billion alone, annually. So there are a lot of cuts along those lines that we have to look at, that I do talk about, but neither of us, to your earlier point, is going to be able to come up with the full magnitude of cuts that we need to today. It's about priorities, and what I'm saying, once again, is that supporting programs like the Child Nutrition Act would be a priority, but I can't make a false promise based on numbers when I don't know what those numbers are.
Listen, I understand, Senator Calogero, but you didn't actually identify any spending cuts there. You said that you wouldn't support the continuation of the stimulus spending as ongoing spending. Well, nobody's proposing that today, and you just said that you would support cutting spending for the 20% of programs that don't work without identifying what those programs are. People want specifics. People want to know if you're talking about their school lunch program. People want to know if you're talking about their job. People want specifics.
Gentlemen, next question. First to Representative Murphy. With Anthem's recent 40% rate hike for individual insurees, what do you feel about a public option for individuals who need insurance?
I supported a public option in part because I think people should have more choice. While I support healthcare reform upon a platform of private insurance, I want people out there to be able to have the greatest degree of choice as possible. Because the problem is, in a market in which power is so consolidated in the hands of a few insurers, you can see these type of abusive rate increases. Now, Anthem has proposed 47% this year. They proposed 30% last year. We have confidence that the regulators will roll that number back. But the reason that I supported healthcare reform is so that we can transfer the balance of power away from insurers and to patients. That's what this bill does, by giving tax credits to individuals and to businesses in order to afford insurance, to allow small businesses and individuals to be able to pool their resources together to push down those type of rate increases. That's the power of the marketplace, and new rules to make sure that those insurers can't get away with kicking people off coverage just because they get sick or denying insurance to people who think that they are sick. Senator Calogero has been a good friend of the insurance industry as a member of the state legislature. He's even gone so far as to vote against legislation that would tell insurers that it's not a pre-existing condition to be a woman. Right now, you can be priced more just because of your gender. Senator Calogero voted with the insurance industry in order to continue that discriminatory practice. The question is, who's going to stand up to those interests in Washington? I think in this case, the answer is clear.
Senator Calogero, with Anthem's recent 40% rate hike for individual insurees, what do you feel about a public option for individuals who need insurance?
The reason we have a 47% rate hike that's just been approved by the Connecticut Insurance Commissioner is because of the very healthcare legislation that Congressman Murphy supported. It was predicted at the time that the legislation was going through the process that it would result in rate hikes of at least 10 to 13%. The increase of up to 47% is absolutely astonishing. It's something we have to lower as much as humanly possible, but it's ultimately a direct result of the kind of legislation that Congressman Murphy supported. And that's exactly what experts predicted would happen, and he went ahead and voted for it, notwithstanding. I oppose the public option, and the reason why I oppose the public option is because I think it's a phenomenally bad idea for the government to ultimately become responsible for our healthcare system. All you have to do is see how the Medicaid program is working right now. Medicaid is one of the most expensive programs the state of Connecticut has to find a way to fund. And ultimately, our reimbursement rates are so low because we can't keep up with the cost of the program that providers are being forced to consider pulling out. Hospitals that have high Medicaid populations are being forced to consider merging and closing. The number of docs involved is lower than ever before. And it's all because when the federal government or the state government takes on an obligation, it never properly funds it. But here's what happens then. Not only do you bankrupt us financially through the increases that are pushed through, but it ultimately hurts the quality of care. Ask anybody who's trying to go through the Medicaid system right now. God forbid we should have a healthcare system like the one that Congressman Murphy supports. He doesn't think this bill went far enough. I think it ought to be repealed and we ought to start again because there's a better way to do it.
Please hold your applause. Thank you.
Senator Calogero, I always find it somewhat interesting when you criticize the Medicaid program. The state government runs the Medicaid program. You're in charge of the Medicaid program. It's my understanding that you voted against some of the budgets that you take credit for, in part because it didn't cut the Medicaid program enough. So you bear responsibility over the last 4 years for a Medicaid program that has been underfunded. I've made it my mission both in the state legislature and in Congress to improve that Medicaid program. You're right, we do have a two-tier healthcare system. but you have to answer for why you in the state legislature have in fact been calling for greater cuts to a program that you now bemoan as being underfunded.
Well, it's really simple, because we can't afford it. And somebody's got to be willing to say that. And when you propose increasing, and one of the reasons why I think this health care bill is such a disaster is because the primary way that this expands coverage is through the expansion of the Medicaid entitlement. And after 10 years, guess who's responsible for paying that? All of you, because it's going to become the obligation of the state of Connecticut. You've got to say no at some point, and the notion that we would continue to increase a program whose funding levels we can't keep up with now is a disaster, and that's why someone has to be able to say no, Congressman.
We have to say no to the existing system. The existing system is bankrupting this nation. And this idea that people who don't have health care insurance aren't getting health care is ridiculous. The people that we're going to be moving on to Medicaid are going to be getting lower cost preventative health care, whereas they are now, right now, showing up in our emergency rooms getting the highest cost health care. And that should be something I frankly think that should be nonpartisan. We should agree that a much better healthcare system involves moving people off of the roles of the emergency rooms and onto the roles of preventative care. But the idea that we can accept the existing system is ridiculous.
Gentlemen, you are both running, Congressman Murphy, you are out of bank time, and Senator Caligiuri, you have 2 minutes of bank time.
Just very quickly. Congressman, you and I agree on that. We just disagree over how to get there. And I think that what you advocated was the wrong way to do it.
Next question, we'll start with Senator Caligiuri. In response to the subprime mortgage meltdown, would you support reinstating the Glass-Steagall Act to reform banking?
The answer is no. And the reason for that is because the banks that actually availed themselves of deregulation after Gramm-Leach-Bliley aren't any of the banks that actually failed. The banks that failed in the Wall Street collapse were the ones that remained single-source investment banks. They're not the ones that actually benefited from deregulation in the first place. So reinstituting the barriers of Glass-Steagall isn't going to help the problem, because the real problem was both parties encouraging through Fannie and Freddie people to buy homes they couldn't afford. And then Fannie and Freddie pushing us towards more and more lax underwriting standards that were encouraging people ultimately to get into financial obligations they couldn't afford. And with Fannie and Freddie basically serving as a guarantee for all of these mortgages, which we are all now footing the bill for, because the U.S. government has stepped in, that's why we're in the mess today, not because of the repeal of Glass-Steagall. And so I wouldn't support the reinstitution of Glass-Steagall, because it wouldn't have solved the problem that got us into the mess that we're in the first place. What I would do is something that Congressman Murphy hasn't supported thus far, which is real reform at Fannie and Freddie. The way you're going to fix this problem once and for all, forget Glass-Steagall, is to make Fannie and Freddie totally independent from the government. Don't allow them to have it both ways, because right now they get to privatize gain for their stockholders, but they socialize loss because the federal government guarantees it, which means the American taxpayers guarantee it. And that's why, and that's what encouraged Fannie and Freddie to make absolutely reckless decisions about underwriting. That's where we need to make reform in order to prevent the crisis from ever happening again.
Congressman Murphy, in response to the subprime mortgage meltdown, would you support reinstating the Glass-Steagall Act to reform banking?
I would support re-erecting some of the barriers designed to separate deposit functions from investment functions, but Senator Caligiuri is just absolutely wrong to say that I have not supported the reform of Fannie and Freddie. In fact, one of the first pieces of legislation that I supported and voted for when I became a member of Congress was a very strong reform bill in order to put a new regulator on Fannie and Freddie, to put limits on the amount of money that they could put at risk. The problem is that the horse had already run out of the barn, that the Bush administration, having stood in the way of the regulation of Fannie and Freddie for 8 years, had precipitated the crisis that had already occurred. We have passed regulatory reform of Fannie and Freddie, and actually, as to the end result, I don't think that Senator Caligiuri and I really disagree. I think the end result does need to be making it very clear that Fannie and Freddie should have a private function and a private level of oversight. But the notion or the idea that I haven't supported that just isn't grounded in fact. Senator Caligiuri opposes the Wall Street reform legislation and has called for its repeal. I think that would be a very, very bad idea for this economy. Right now we have running in this district about $1 million worth of ads running against me in support of Senator Caligiuri, being funded by many of the Wall Street interests that want to go back to the days of the wild, wild west in which there was no accountability on Wall Street. Are there things in that bill that I would have done differently? Absolutely, but the answer is not to repeal it.
The reason I would have voted against the financial reform bill is because it did nothing to get to the heart of the crisis that we're in the first place, which is Fannie, Freddie, their underwriting standards, and the lack of independence in the federal government backing it up, thereby encouraging very risky behavior. That's why I would have voted against it, because I don't think it did anything to really get to the heart of the crisis that we're all suffering from today.
Next question starts with Representative Murphy. College students, jobs and loans. How will you help college students who come out of school with no jobs and their credit scores are suffering because they can't repay student loans?
I'm proud of the fact that during the time that I've been in Congress, we have increased the maximum allowable Pell Grant by 33%. That's meant that more students can go to school. I'm proud of the fact that we reformed the way that the student loan industry is run to take away the subsidies from private lenders that were making millions, if not billions, off of the backs of students and transferring that money into students' pockets by increasing the Pell Grant, increasing the Perkins loan eligibility, and cutting the interest rate for student loans in half. I'm proud of the provisions of the Recovery Act that Senator Caligiuri opposes that would increase the tax credit for higher education expenses. We've defrayed the cost of education, reduced the obligations of students who take out loans by thousands of dollars, thereby opening up an opportunity that grew my family, grew Senator Caligiuri's family, and so many others. Again, when I get frustrated with Senator Caligiuri's insistence that he would support spending cuts without specificity, it's because I worry, and many people in this audience worry, that they would come at the expense of students. That as you look at the 15 to 20% cuts in discretionary spending that would be necessary in order to impose the programs that the tax cuts for billionaires and millionaires that Senator Caligiuri supports, it's likely that some of those would come to the very programs that have essentially allowed so many middle-class Americans to recognize and realize the American dream. But I'm proud of our record in the last 2 to 4 years with respect to education. I think that we have to recognize that in the long term, the greatest investment that we can make in our economy, the greatest investment we can make in closing the gap between rich and poor is an investment in education, whether it be at the elementary school level, whether that be at the elementary school level, whether it be at the secondary school level, or whether that be with respect to higher education.
Senator Caligiuri, how will you help college students who come out of school with no jobs and credit scores that are suffering because they can't repay student loans?
Sure. Well, by creating jobs again, which you can't do under the economic philosophy that Chris Murphy and Nancy Pelosi have advocated. And the proof is all in what we've been living through for the last several years. And it goes back to what we've talked about. One of the reasons why I'm a strong supporter of spending cuts and spending caps on the entire federal budget is because we need to balance that budget, we need to eliminate the deficit, but we need to do it without raising taxes. If we can take our spending back down to 20% of gross domestic product, which is where it was for 10 years before Congressman Murphy took office, we would be able to balance the budget, eliminate the deficit, and do it anywhere in the next 5 to 10 years. That's one of the best gifts we can leave a college student today, because it would be giving them a federal government that's spending at a much more sustainable rate. It would allow more capital to be in the hands of the private sector so that they could actually have a job. But where Congressman Murphy and I agree is on the importance of education. My parents were both immigrants to this country. My dad came here from Italy. My mom came here from Canada. Neither of them had over a grade school education. They worked in factories night and day and on weekends to pursue the American dream, which for them meant giving my brother John and me the very best education humanly possible. So I'm going to be a strong supporter of student loans as much as I can, because I'm still paying my student loans back. They were a critical part of how I was able to afford a college education. But from a macro perspective, ladies and gentlemen, Congressman Murphy and I have fundamental disagreements over how to grow the economy. And what I would say to you is, if you think his approach is right, why haven't we seen any real job growth? If his approach is good, why do we have 9% unemployment in Connecticut and 13% unemployment in New Britain? It's failing.
Next question, we start with with Senator Caligiuri. What should be done at the federal level to reduce our use of and dependence on fossil fuels and spur the use of clean energy?
Well, as I said earlier, that's got to be an important part of a comprehensive energy strategy. We need to use, as I said earlier, heavy tax investment with research and development tax credits in clean and renewable energy technology, tax credits and other tax incentives for the development of those policies and those technologies, because as much as we can move off of our reliance on fossil fuels, we can and we should. And that needs to be an important part of our overall strategy. But the reality is, we're never going to be able to completely eliminate, anytime in the foreseeable future, our reliance on fossil fuels. And that's why one of the components of, in my judgment, a good, sound, overall comprehensive energy policy is to make sure that we're also maximizing as much as possible the energy resources that are available to us domestically through drilling and through other ways of accessing it that are environmentally sensitive. And today we've got technologies that allow us to do it in a more environmentally sensitive fashion than ever before. We also need to invest in our national energy infrastructure. We've got plentiful capacity of natural gas, but we've got a capacity to transmit that doesn't match the amount of natural gas we have. So one of the long-term energy policy goals that I would be seeking is to make sure that we're investing in our national energy infrastructure, which includes transmission capacity for natural gas as an important part of an overall strategy. But there's no question, we need to move off of reliance on fossil fuels as much as we can. And we need to use tax policy primarily to try to encourage research and development and the growth of industries and technologies that will allow us to do it.
Representative Murphy, what should be done at the federal level to reduce our use of and dependence on fossil fuels and spur the use of clean energy?
Well, I applaud Senator Caligiuri for his courage standing up for environmentally sensitive drilling practices as a means to expand out our domestic energy resources. We absolutely need to find bridge technologies. I would suggest that we should be a little bit more careful about relying on drilling and the mantra of drill, baby, drill that we've been hearing from a lot of people in this country over the past 5 years, given our experience of this summer. The bridge technologies for me are certainly gas and are nuclear. I think we can make a tremendous investment in nuclear power in this country. I think we're on the verge of a renaissance. Those are bridge technologies, though, to get us to a day in which we can power this country with domestically produced renewable energy. Senator Caligiuri has supported tax incentives and tax credits, which is essentially the existing policy. We need a transformational change in the way that our energy policy is run in this country. I've supported a much more aggressive bill that I understand is controversial, but I think its time is here. That if we make an investment today in renewable energy by creating a real domestic market for that type of product, we can capture the jobs that we have lost to China and to Germany and to places all around the world. Senator Caligiuri said, well, you know, Representative Murphy's economic plan hasn't worked. Well, listen, I think it's a little premature to expect that 8 years of economic malfeasance can be turned around in a year and a half. And the work that we're doing now to make those investments in clean energy and green energy jobs is about the type of investments in the future that have not been made for the last decade. Is it an investment? Does it take some money up front in order to get there? It absolutely does. But the kind of short-term, profit-driven policy that we've seen in Washington over the last 8 years has wrought the disaster that we are living with today.
How much time do I have? I keep seeing 2 minutes up there, but I can't imagine. Do I
Still 2, huh?
About 2 minutes?
Yeah, that was right. So, well, I still have 0. Something screwy's going on, Caligiuri.
I'm afraid I have to agree.
I've been watching.
Are you sure it's still 2 minutes for Senator Caligiuri?
Oh, I'm adding to my time for my break.
Oh, okay.
Look, you know, when Congressman Murphy talks about a transformational energy policy, I think what he means, euphemistically, is cap and trade. And if that's what he means, then I've got to take issue with that, because it's going to be transformational. It's going to be transformationally disastrous for our economy. Because even the president and the Democratic administration has said, President Obama has said personally, that under cap and trade, the very legislation that Congressman Murphy supported and proudly co-sponsored, electric rates nationally would, quote, necessarily skyrocket. The Obama administration's own Treasury Department has said that the cap and trade bill that Congressman Murphy supported and proudly co-sponsored in the House would result in an additional tax increase to the American people of over $200 billion, which is 15%, according to the Treasury Department, for every single American, including, by the way, the very group that Congressman Murphy purports to want to help so badly, manufacturing, which is a very energy-intensive industry, and which, by the way, as an industry, opposes federal cap and trade. So, transformational is a great word. It sounds nice, but when you look into what it actually means, according to the policies that Congressman Murphy says are transformational, I think the better word is disastrous.
Well, that number is totally different than what the Energy Information Administration says. That administration, which is responsible for analyzing energy legislation, says that at most it could cause a $6 per month increase in rates for consumers. And we have to look at that as an investment in all of the jobs that it will create, and frankly, part of our military budget. One of the most important investments in the national security of this country is making our nation energy independent. It is crazy that we are essentially chasing our oil dollars around the globe with military and foreign aid dollars. And so I look at an investment in renewable energy production and domestic energy capacity, just like I look at an investment in our military. Is there going to be a small monthly cost to this transformation? There probably is, but it is a worthwhile investment and is nowhere near as large as the numbers that you throw around.
We're all on your time at this point, Senator Cowan.
I would just add that whatever agency you reference should be talking to President Obama and his Treasury Department, because it was President Obama and his Treasury Department which said that your bill would result in a 15% tax increase for every single American. I suppose one way to eliminate energy dependence on outside sources would be to eliminate the need for energy altogether by shutting down businesses. And it's the kind of policies that you've advocated, including cap and trade, that would have exactly that effect.
So please hold your applause. Thank you. Gentlemen, we have time for 2 more questions before closing statements. The first one goes to Senator Caligiuri, and I want to emphasize that I read these questions exactly as they come to me. In what way, if any...
That makes me worried.
Well,
you have to preface it that way.
In what way, if any, would you work to change, quote, Obamacare?
Well, we're talking about the health care legislation that was enacted in part with Congressman Murphy's support. I would start by voting to repeal it. And if I can't repeal it, I would vote to defund it. Because while in an American society like ours, in a civilized society like ours, every single American should have access to quality, affordable health care. It is the cornerstone of a civilized society like the one we're in now, and like the one that I know Congressman Murphy and I both want to be supporting. The question is, what's the best way to get there? And I don't believe that the bill that Congressman Murphy supported, in which he said didn't even go far enough, is the right way to do it. The $500 billion in tax increases, the $500 billion in cuts to Medicare, including a $100 billion cut to the Medicare Advantage program, the single largest expansion to the Medicaid entitlement since it was enacted, estimated increases in insurance premiums of 10 to 13%, and we're seeing 47% here in Connecticut. None of that, my friends, is the right way to do it. I think the better way to do it is to use private sector alternatives, including using a very expansive tax credit to make it affordable for small businesses to provide health insurance to their employees, because guess what? Most of the uninsured work, and most of them work for the smallest employers in Connecticut, and they're not getting it from their employers now because their employers can't afford to provide it. So if we make it more affordable using the current employer-based system for small businesses to provide it, we can tremendously increase access, help control costs from one perspective, and start to do it without growing the size of the federal government, which I think is ruinous for our economy, bad for the quality of care. There's a tax credit provision in the bill, but it's limited in scope, limited in duration, and highly conditional, and therefore a lot less effective than the kind of expansive credit that I would be advocating as the centerpiece of my reform proposal.
Representative Murphy, in what way, if any?
I heard the question.
Okay.
The tax credit in the bill is the foundation of the bill. The The tax credit in the bill is about 2/3 of the cost. It would result in about 20 million Americans getting insurance through a tax credit that would help individuals purchase private insurance. And again, Senator Calgieri can't have it both ways. He can't come out and say that he supports spending reductions and he supports entitlement reform, and then at the same time try to attack the $500 billion in the bill that seeks to reform the Medicare program. Let me tell you what those Medicare Advantage plans were doing that Senator Calgieri is sticking up for. I've said he's been a good friend of insurance companies, and this is yet another example. Insurance companies have told us that they can run the Medicare program for less than Medicare can do it. We've heard over and over that private companies can do government functions at a lower cost than the government can do it. Well, guess what? We pay Medicare Advantage plans 113% of what it costs the Medicare program to run its own program. Yes, this bill does cut reimbursement rates to Medicare Advantage plans by about $160 billion, but simply by requiring them to run the program at the same cost that the federal government does. If you sit on any investor conference call from Humana or any of the major insurance companies, they will tell you that the largest source of their ever-increasing profits comes from the money they get from the Medicare Advantage program. So Senator Calgieri over and over suggests that he is interested in restraining the size of government. And so far today, not only hasn't been able to identify one major spending cut that he would support, but opposes $500 billion in reductions to Medicare spending that do not come at the expense of beneficiaries. Beneficiaries get increased benefits. The donut hole is eliminated. Preventative costs go away. But you can't have it both ways, Senator Calgieri. You can't continue to say that you would be for spending reductions, but then over and over again be against tough, hard spending cuts that this Congress is putting into place.
You have about a minute left.
2 quick points. I'd encourage you to remember that the insurance industry employs about 40,000 people in Connecticut, many of whom live in this region in the Farmington Valley. And the more you demonize that industry and the more you advance policies that are actually destructive to those jobs, you're actually adding to our economic woes in addition to bankrupting this country and raising taxes. My friends, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services said that the bill that Congressman Murphy supported proudly will actually see an increase in Medicare spending of anywhere from 9 to 13%. This doesn't control spending, and that was above and beyond what was already expected.
Don't accuse me of demonizing an industry just because I'm critical of it. I'll call out my friends and people that I disagree with when I think they've done something wrong, but just because I say that they're being reimbursed at 13% higher than Medicare spends on the benefit doesn't mean I'm demonizing the industry.
This is the end of bank time, gentlemen. This is the last question. Senator Calgieri, you begin. How would you better the economic status of the 5th District?
By putting a policy in place that allows us to grow jobs again. We've talked about it a lot. It's the central defining issue of this campaign. And you do it ultimately by putting as much capital back into the free market as possible. You do that by reducing deficits. I would reduce and eliminate our deficit by bringing spending back down to 20% of gross domestic product, which would eliminate our federal deficit without raising taxes in the next 5 to 10 years. Then we have to keep tax rates as low as possible because taxes confiscate capital that could otherwise we can be using to grow jobs, grow the economy through your spending as families and through the investment of businesses. I would do that by fully extending the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts. I would also reduce the corporate tax from 35 to 25%. And then the third thing you have to do is reject the kind of job-killing mandates that Chris Murphy has consistently supported. Obamacare is a job killer because of what it does to the cost of government. Federal cap and trade is a job killer. There's a provision in the health care bill that Congressman Murphy proudly supported requiring every business in the United States and in the 5th District to file a 1099 with the IRS every time they make an expenditure of $600. That's a job killer, and it's utterly ridiculous. That's how I would work to improve the economy in the 5th District.
Representative Murphy, how would you better the economic status of the 5th District?
We've been up here for about an hour and a half now, and we are still left with absolutely no idea how Senator Caligiuri would reduce the deficit. We have no specific examples of spending cuts. An invitation to pass along an additional $700 trillion in tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans without any specific ideas on how to change that ongoing liability of the federal government. So I hear Senator Caligiuri saying that he's going to help the economy by reducing the deficit, and then we continue to hear policies that would do nothing but exacerbate the deficit. The way that you fix this economy is by focusing on middle-class tax relief, the people that are going to put the money right back into the economy. That's why I've supported $700 to $800 billion already in middle-class tax relief, why I've supported $70 billion in small business tax relief. And it's why I care so much about manufacturing. People are hurting in New Britain. You walk around this city and you ask me if our current trade policies and our current commitment to Buy America policies has worked for this city. It has not. In the audience today is my mother and father. Their families, my mother's family, was built on the great manufacturing jobs provided by Fafner Bearing Company. The reason why I'm fighting every day for policies that make sure that our taxpayer dollars are spent here in New Britain and in the United States rather than in Shanghai and Frankfurt is because my family was built on those jobs. And Senator Caligiuri's position on Buy America has shifted by the day. First he was in favor of it, then he opposed it, then he only opposed a portion of it. I assume he's learning more about it, but it certainly suggests a very different level of commitment to targeting federal dollars to U.S. jobs than I've displayed in the last 10 years. You fix this economy by really focusing on the deficit, rather than just talking about it. You fix this economy by targeting tax relief to small businesses and to middle-class families rather than to millionaires and billionaires. And you fix this economy by having an actual, real commitment to making sure that all the taxpayer dollars that we send to Washington get spent here in the United States.
That concludes the question and answer. It doesn't conclude the debate. It concludes the question and answer portion of the debate. Each candidate now has opportunity for a 2-minute summation or rebuttal. Representative Murphy, you're first.
Well, again, let me thank all of our sponsors. Let me thank Senator Caligiuri. I think you see the spirit in which we both approach this. We are friends before and after, and it's always good to join him on the stage today. I think what you've seen is two very different visions. The question for this economy is whether we move forward or whether we go backward. I want to focus tax cuts on the middle class and on small businesses. Senator Caligiuri favors essentially returning to the Bush economic policy, which gave the predominance of tax cuts to millionaires and billionaires and people who, in the end, are going to put most of that money into savings, not into our own economy. Senator Caligiuri won't stand up against the outsourcers like I will, whether it comes to Buy American policy or making sure that we never again authorize tax incentives for people that ship jobs overseas. And Senator Caligiuri and I differ on how we should approach the Wall Street financial scandal. I think we should stand up to the Wall Street companies and pass strong financial reform. Senator Caligiuri opposes that bill and still hasn't offered any real specifics as to how he would hold Wall Street accountable. I go back to my mother, who's here in the audience. I get to be a member of Congress because of the great middle-class manufacturing jobs that built the Lusick family here in New Britain. I want to go back to the place in which we can have not a disappearing middle class, but a strong and healthy middle class. And that does not happen by going back to the same policies that got us into this mess in the first place. It's been the honor of my life to be able to represent the town that in part grew and built my family. I appreciate the opportunity to be here for this debate, and I ask for your vote this November.
Senator Caligiuri.
Great. I'd like to thank you all once again for being here and to thank Congressman Murphy for another excellent debate. It's always a pleasure and a privilege. You know, I can remember when my dad, who was a factory worker, was laid off because of tough economic times. And I can remember worrying as a family about where we were going to get the next meal. I remember him looking as far and as wide as he needed to find a job, and eventually found one working as a carpenter on the side for a builder. Who had a little bit of work for him to do. I've lived the financial crisis in very real ways. And the reason why I'm running for Congress is because I think our country is heading in the wrong direction. And it starts with a fiscal policy that's done absolutely nothing to grow jobs again. And I guess the question for each and every one of you here and everyone watching is, do you think that the policies that Chris Murphy, Nancy Pelosi, and the President have been advocating are working? If you think that going from a $100 billion deficit to a $2 trillion deficit is working, you should vote for Congressman Murphy. If you think that having unemployment of 9% in Connecticut, 10% nationally, 13% in New Britain is working, you should vote for Congressman Murphy. See, I don't think those policies are working, and I would like to take a very different approach. One that would differ, including from what Republicans did when they had the majority in Congress. I think Republicans went wrong when they ended up spending every bit as much as they used to accuse the Democrats of doing, which is why I'm very proud to be the only Republican to have stood up, even to my own party, to say no to a state budget we couldn't afford. That's the kind of leadership we need in Washington, and I'm the only one who's proven willing to stand up and make those tough decisions. I'm going to make them by pushing for a spending cap on the entire federal budget that reins in the growth of spending to 20% of our gross domestic product, as the cornerstone way of forcing Congress, both members of Congress, to make the spending cuts they've never been willing to make. And then I would work to make sure that we keep tax rates as low as possible, because I'm absolutely convinced, and economists tell you this all the time, that's how you really grow the economy, not through the big government spending Keynesian approach that Congressman Murphy has advocated. It's failed. It always fails. I would take a very different approach. It would be based on spending controls, keeping taxes low, keeping government mandates low, so that we can free your lives up as much as possible. And if you own a business, free your business up as much as possible to grow, prosper, thrive, and hire. It's a privilege to be here. It's a privilege to be the Republican nominee to be your congressman, and I'd ask for your vote on November 2nd. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please hold your applause. This concludes the debate. On behalf of the League of Women Voters, I want to thank both candidates, and you may now applaud both.